Welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt. I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Today I'll be talking to Shannon Swales, who describes herself as a perfectly imperfect clinical psychologist. She's passionate about supporting others with the mental health knowledge and skills to really thrive in life, to move from stressed out, burnt out states to ones of wellness. Shannon has had her own burnout experience, and in 2021, she stopped work to go through a process of recovery. She now very generously shares her own experiences and all that she learned to help others on the road to recovery. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and so I bring you Shannon Swales. Your thing, but just tell us first of all about that. Like what is your passion, at the moment, or your passion in your work or life?
Well, I suppose my passion really in work and in life, because it sort of crosses over both, is finding a living my life in a way and helping others living a life in a way that's sustainable, but not just sustainable, but allows them to thrive in whatever areas they're wanting to thrive in, family, individual, like study, work, whatever it might be, health. But yeah, I like the word sustainability, but I like the thriving. So, because sustainability sort of seems like, okay, we're able to sustain like a status quo, like whether that be our health, our work, finding a balance. But I feel like, thriving from there, growing from there. So it's my passion for myself to work towards that or keeping that. And at the same time, helping others do that as well. Because I find a lot of us are, certainly, living under sort of chronic loads of stress and that our life isn't something, or the way we're living life is not sustainable. And for some people, it's not something that's giving them meaning or purpose or feeling like they're growing or contributing. Sometimes it's contributing back to their community. Yeah. So that's my passion, I'd say. Yeah.
One of the things that it prompted me right at the beginning of what you were saying there is I sort of said, sort of work and life, and you sort of made the point. It's sort of they're one thing really, in a way. I mean, it's sort of interesting to think of. We sometimes talk about work-life balance, but as if they're separate almost or something. I mean, but I don't know. What are your thoughts there? What are your comments about that?
Well, the thing that springs to mind, and this is I don't know if it's a controversy in the literature around burnout, but it certainly seems to be talked about amongst people who are in the burnout area, that burnout is a occupational syndrome. Predominantly, it's triggered by workplace. But then when you're working in the grassroots with the people who are going through it, and even myself, when I went through it, it's not just work life. And sometimes it's not even the work life that is triggering this chronic stress load. It's actually the stuff outside of work life. But, life encompasses work. That's one aspect of it. But it's these other loads that we might be taking, our raising children, maybe caring for our elderly parents or for our children with, they might have chronic illnesses or whatever it might be, that we've got these other loads, outside of work. And I find like people I see or talk to, people I see in terms of clients or people I talk to, they get confused. It's like, well, is this burnout if it's not happening at work? And I'm like, look, whatever, it's chronic stress. Burnout is a chronic stress syndrome. And there's a lot of ways in which we capture that, but burnout is one of the labels, I suppose. But so I kind of eradicate that whole work-life balance thing. It's just life. And am I living it in a way that's sustainable at the moment, or is it actually where I can grow and thrive? And that's
the other thing you said, which I really appreciate as well. And in some of my work around compassion, Paul Gilbert, who you know and know of, and I
sort of love, he would say really that, yes, compassion is about alleviating and preventing suffering, but also about flourishing. You know, we want to be able to thrive or flourish and get real meaning and purpose out of our life. And there's a whole range of areas to do that, isn't there? It might be at work, but it might be at home or the community or other things that we're doing. And oddly, well, that's interesting, isn't it? In some ways, our meaning can come from all sorts of places, but you know, therefore, we can become depleted too. There can we in all of those different places, and so burnout is a kind of a sort of, there's many potential pathways to burnout.
Oh, certainly, and I think they're still discovering. They are still discovering and understanding that. You know, for some people, it can be that. Work is just not actually, it's something that I recently went to a online workshop developed by done by, what his name, Nicholas Petrie, who's for the last few years he's devoted his work around understanding burnout, particularly in leadership roles. But he was talking about one of the pathways in his research that they've noticed into burnout is that work hasn't allowed enough growth opportunity, like you know, where there's wanted or needed by the person, that they've become stagnant. So burnout can arise out of that, which I often thought about it and knew about it initially from more of a workload, high workload, low resources pathway in, which is as well. And it was just interesting that that's what he also found, where there wasn't these growth opportunities and support in growing within the workplace, within their industry or profession, that can lead to as well. I suppose that's that meaninglessness or that disconnection from their work as well.
People, it might be sort of feeling overworked, or it might be feeling underworked. But both of those can lead to stress. So you're a clinical psychologist, you're a therapist, you're also many other things. But I thought it would be really interesting to hear a bit about your journey into being a therapist. I really appreciate later if we also talk about kind of what happened next and all that you kind of experienced there. But what was your journey in? So to speak.
Well, I've done a lot of reflection around that in the last couple of years, but so it's taken a bit of a different story. But essentially, I was in my early 20s and I was working as a shift supervisor at a very well-renowned still coffee place. And I didn't drink coffee at the time. I do now. But anyway, I had this regular customer and her husband who'd come in, and lovely, lovely couple. They're probably in their 50s. And she was talking about studying psychology. And I was like, okay. And we'd have these conversations about what she was learning. And it was just really intrigued me and I was interested. And I don't know what point that I decided that, okay, this would be interesting to go forth and study, because I was anxious about studying. I didn't think that I was someone who was capable of studying at a university level. I had a lot of doubts around that. But it really came down to, I had nothing better to do. I wasn't really, the hospitality industry was certainly getting me down. It wasn't an area that I wanted to stay in. And I just was really intrigued. And I remember thinking that I just wanted to understand humans better. I didn't really get them. I didn't really get people. Right. So I was like, okay, this will be really helpful. So, I put in my application and got into undergrad. It was a Bachelor of Science major in psych, distance ed as well. So I was doing it from home up in Cairns. And it really, I did really well. Like I was getting good marks, but I was also enjoying it. I was really enjoying learning and learning and really starting to understand humans, but also understand myself, which I didn't realize that that's really why much later on, I realized there was, I think my intuitive self that I wasn't listening to back then, she knew I needed that. She knew I needed to actually go there to learn about myself, not other people. But yeah, so that was my journey into psych, and I just kept going because I was enjoying it. I was enjoying learning. So I just kept following the pathway, but I have come to realize that at some point I didn't stop to actually listen exactly where I wanted to take psych. And I kind of ended up on what I now know is I ended up on the bandwagon of becoming a clinical psych and doing individual therapy, but it wasn't exactly where I wanted to be. But I've only just learned that in the last few years. Yeah, sort of just followed that pathway, and it sort of seemed to be that's where everybody was going, into the clinical psych. And I did want to do one-on-one work. I did want to provide therapy, and that's something I still want, and I am doing, and still want to do. But yeah, it was just, I suppose if I stopped and listened for a little bit, I probably would have gone in different directions back then, within the psychology, within the mental health field, but different directions. Yeah. But, yeah.
I mean, it does sound like, curiosity is in your bones almost, or something, like when you were even at the coffee shop, you're sort of interested and curious and talking to people, and just sort of stumbled across this kind of character, I guess, in your life story, who made a sort of a bit of an impact.
Yeah, she's so cool. Yeah, I've forgotten her name, which I always feel like she's such an integral part, and I visually can see her and her husband, even their orders. I think I remember. Remember that? Yeah, strange how you still remember that 20 years on. Yeah, so yeah.
And may I mention, we first sort of kind of crossed paths and connected. I'm not sure how many years ago this was too, but you were working at Quitline, and I was doing sort of occasional MI training, and at certain points you were helping to manage all of that as well. And
yeah.
I mean, how many years ago is that now?
I started Quitline in 2008, which was the first year of my postgraduate training as well in clinical psych. So I started Quitline at the same time, and that was when, in the introductory training, there was 2 days MI, and that's when I first met you. And yes, so many other training, and then I became the team leader, organizing the training of the newbies, the new counselors, and so organizing with you. So and that was 2008 to 2013 I worked there.
That's a long time ago.
Yeah, I know.
Actually.
And then I worked there in 2016 to 17 as well, just briefly too. But it was a long time ago. Yeah.
15 years ago you started there.
Yeah.
So and well, I mean, that's kind of, it puts things into perspective, because you worked in and around the area for many years. I know though that a big part of it was just a few years ago, I think sort of 2021 or thereabout, you sort of I know that you're sort of okay to share with us a little bit what happened sort of next there. You really kind of took a bit of a hit, and things sort of changed. So what tell us about that part of the story.
So the date, I always remember, 25th February 2021, which was really just the day in which it all hit. It was really a slow burn, as we know burnout is. And it wasn't just burnout. It was certainly compassion fatigue that often, especially with helping professionals, often burnout and compassion fatigue go together, but also vicarious trauma. And I was working with Dr. Hayley Quinn, actually, who in compassion focused therapy, but she was my supervisor at the time. So we've been working together for about, I think, her as my supervisor for about a year. And it was through her work with me, and I connected with her because I wanted to learn and integrate compassion focused therapy into my work. And so that's why I was seeking supervision from her. And through supervision, really starting to recognize the depths of what was happening for me, and how it was coming out in my work. And with her compassion, she was seriously my first compassionate other that really guided me towards recognizing what I was experiencing and starting to make some changes while I was still working. So, so I was recognizing prior to February 21 that I wasn't okay and needed to make some changes to my life and my work. So everything to help sustainability. And at the time, we were just looking at sustainability really. And it just got by February 21, it was too little too late in a way. And I just literally couldn't go to work. And so things stopped from that day in terms of seeing clients. I was working in and had been working in private practice from 2013 full time. And yeah, so it was horrible. Even though I've worked through and processed the shame and the guilt that I felt was such an abrupt exit, it still, it still pains me because it's not ideal, obviously, for clients and for the business. And, there's so many ramifications of that. But yeah, and I think by then I actually realized, I realized it was burnout. I even thought it might be a bit of depression. And I started working with a psychologist from there. And yeah, it was just complete, utter exhaustion. And probably the other thing was I just didn't have the compassion left in me to give. Like I had been using every ounce that I had. Like my family would say I wasn't a nice person to be around. I wasn't horrible either, but there was no compassion at home because all that I had, I give to the clients because, well, it's necessary. And then I just had nothing. It was like the tanks just absolutely were empty and I couldn't bring myself to be in front of a client. Yeah, it was horrible. Yeah.
That's kind of helpful to hear you describe it, because there are sometimes kind of those red flags or something, the little earlier warning signs. You'd kind of notice things and you were sort of trying to wisely work with that and through supervision and so on. And yet on the other hand, it was hard to do so. It was hard to really, I don't know, kind of turn the tide a little bit on that, I guess.
I think because, and I see this a lot in the clients I work with now and just conversations I have with people who've been through it or going through it. And they, once you start to recognize that, okay, I need to make some changes, already you don't have a lot left in the tank to actually do those changes, because change still takes energy. And changes are required. Like even shifting down the number of clients I saw a day, well, you're managing that with the clients, and that takes energy. You're managing that. I worked in a group practice, so managing that with the director, and she was my other compassionate other. So I was lucky to be met with really, beautiful women who just held that space for me and did not judge, and whatever you need, Shan, we're here. And considering, especially my the director I worked in her practice, Dr. Ilse Grobler, like it was her like I was a full-time psych. It was her income, and so for her to be willing to make any changes that were needed and be met with that. But yeah, all of that requires a lot of energy. And because I was dealing with a pretty harsh critic as well, like just something I've always had, well, since quite a young age, and it was ramped up at that time. It sort of came back with a vengeance. So it's just a lot of energy that you just don't have or have very little of. So that's what I mean by too little, too late in a lot of ways. Once I started making change or started to recognize and started to make changes.
The sort of the compassion definition, sort of alleviate and prevent suffering. I suppose once you're there and you're feeling burnt out and you do things to try to alleviate some of that, some of it probably is helpful, but also you're just sort of a bit out of gas already, and so I suppose prevention becomes an important part of things going forward. But I was wondering about the role of the critic.
The critic,
and also and sort of shame and clinician shame. Like I've been thinking a lot about that too. Just this thing about how clinicians can sometimes feel like I'm not doing enough, I'm not good enough. The person in the room next door is much better than me, and just the way that some of that self-criticism or shame makes it hard to sort of recover or to deal with the burnout, even once we have seen it approaching. So what are your thoughts about self-criticism and shame there?
Shame is such a debilitating emotion in terms of like, it just makes you stand still. Like when you get stuck in it, I mean, like when you stay stuck in it, it just, it does make you move. And I just remember as a pre-burnout, my critic would, like when I, so certainly fused with her and she was like leading the way, she would lead me to like isolation, because I would compare myself with other psychs in that I wasn't good enough. I'd even compare myself to this, what I've come to know, this ideal clinical psych and what she should look like. And then, this really like perfectionistic, unrelenting standards, high expectations, knows everything. And this is the ideal clinical psych. So it's like, the critic was like, because I wasn't living up to that, and of course I couldn't live up to that. So it was. I mean, it's always.
I don't think I've ever met that person.
no, they don't exist. They don't exist. No. I mean, and I knew this up here. Intellect. I did, but I didn't. It wasn't in here. Like I didn't truly understand the critic. I mean, doing the work around the critic and the compassionate work towards the critic, I've come to understand her and what that's all about, and be able to feel compassion for her. But I hadn't done that work, and so the critic was just really a huge part of my burnout and my compassion fatigue, and really just isolated me because I didn't think I was good enough. I didn't seek that guidance and that support, or I mean, I did, but just the bare minimum, and not what I really needed, or what I needed to grow as a clinician too, from that really early stage that now I do. Well, I do a lot, still work in that, but I'm more willing to reach out and learn off other clinicians, learn off anyone. It doesn't matter what their title is, but to grow and to learn and be okay with, being that way. So shame. And I think in the early stages of recovery as well, because I had so much shame around how things, because I even say that, because I let it go. Well, it got so bad that I had to leave, and there was that abrupt transition, for the clients. And whilst my team, certainly helped with that I couldn't be that person, and letting down other people, that was such a huge trigger. And what I did to work through that shame was turn it more into that guilt, or recognize, okay, what were the behaviors there? I can't change what happened, but what could I do differently now, and work on so that doesn't happen again, and also recognizing that there's a lot of things I didn't know and I'm learning now that got me to that place, that if I had known and had worked through, I wouldn't have gotten there. You know what I mean? Like, it's just some forgiveness and compassion towards myself, pre-burnout, or burnout Shannon, or whatever we want to call that. So there was a lot of working through shame in that beginning as well, of really, I always call that the beginning of my recovery was that February, March, because I just actually had the time to really address the issues.
Yes, you sort of described nicely that, the way that the critic latches onto that gap, doesn't it, between the ideal sort of self, or in this case, the ideal kind of therapist and so on, versus kind of the actual sort of who we are, or even versus a kind of an imagined sort of feared self. Sometimes we become really critical, not just because we're not quite meeting the ideal, but because we think we're actually even much worse than we are, and so the critic jumps onto that, and out of that, kind of comes that shameful feeling, and it does, it makes us stuck, and it makes us isolated, and it makes us very sort of, I guess, reluctant or even unable to seek some of the support that would actually be really helpful. We know all of that, but we still don't quite feel it, that sort of head-heart lag that can happen there. And that sounds like was really some of the work, especially after, by the February, March, you had some headspace then to work with that. So,
yeah. I was going to say, once I got, because there was still a lot of report writing and helping in the background to help with the transition of clients. But yeah, certainly there was still some room because I didn't have that one-on-one work to do that. I could start to, and that's where a lot of people find themselves in the space, that they actually need that space to work on those things. It's so much harder when you're still in the thick of work. It's still, it's possible, but something's got to give, I think we need space to process.
So what did you do then to work through sort of all of that, and towards, you mentioned that was kind of like the beginning really of the recovery, and towards your further recovery from there?
Yeah, well, there were so many things. I made this promise that, and this was something to help with that shame too, and I was switching it more to guilt, and I don't want this to happen again. And so I made the promise for a year not to go back to counseling work or any therapy work, even though I felt pulled to do, because financially, I was like, and this is what I'm trained to do and can, certainly help pay the bills and all that kind of stuff. But I knew, well, I'm not in a safe enough place, and therefore I'm not safe enough for the clients either to, I said, look, we're giving yourself a year to I mean, not saying I have to be okay by the end of the year, but just no clinical work, no therapy work for a year. Go off and do other work, but not this work. And it became a year about focusing on learning, or not just learning, but integrating compassion for self, how to look after myself and really listen to the suffering and really lean into that and alleviate that suffering, and learning what all that is. And so that was the theme, I suppose, of that year. But I also discovered quite early on, and it was with my work with the psychologist I saw, and she was clinical and counseling psychologist, and my other compassionate other, Carla Johnston, I recognized quite early with her that I wasn't actually good at allowing others being compassionate towards me, that it was quite a body kind of rejection or resistance to that. So my work became also about letting that in, and also seeking it too, and not just letting it in my relationships, and just, also, like in, I suppose, professional roles too, and with like the therapist, and so I suppose that was an overall theme. There was lots of things that I did, but that was an overall theme. And one of them was actually, as I've shared with you, your book, Gifts, the Gifts of Compassion, which I have here. That was one of them. Because I actually purchased it just before, I'm not sure when it came out. When did it come out? It would have been around that time. It was
2020. End of 2020 maybe. Yes.
So I purchased it, but I hadn't read it yet, so I was still working all that, and I had purchased it to help, again, just certainly helping in practice with my clients by exploring it with myself. But then it became a therapeutic tool for me to really, because I realized, okay, I need to work on this. I knew about self-compassion, I knew about compassion, and I was doing stuff for myself, but I really feel like it was Band-Aid stuff at the time, because I wasn't really going to the depths of my emotions, and I wasn't really leaning in, that really listening, really hearing, and really tending to those needs. So the Gifts of Compassion certainly helped me work through a lot of things, as well as my therapist. My therapist, it was a lot of, we worked a lot more on the vicarious trauma, and she was is an EMDR therapist. So I did that work with her mostly. And just a lot of resting, a lot of exposure to resting and allowing that, because I wasn't very good at, it's okay to rest. It's all right to not work, and it's okay to have nothing planned on your day, and just simply do what is needed on that day, or you know, it might be, well, I always walk my dogs, but that, and having coffee after gym with friends, and that was it, and that it's okay to do that. Yeah, so there's a lot of resting.
It's those dastardly fears of compassion, isn't it, that we're working with there. You know, the sort of we fears, blocks, and resistances. We worry about that, and we find it hard to rest, for example. You know, for whatever reason, we feel like we shouldn't or whatever, and sometimes the critic gets on board with all of that, but sometimes it's just, you know, sort of kind of a part of who we are, how we were brought up, you know, Western culture, various bits and pieces that, for whatever reason,
for me,
have these fears.
I was certainly, like, I did have that thought that this is lazy, but I think the biggest fears and blocks for me with compassion was when it was compassion from other people. I was starting to notice that, like, undeserving, like, I don't know if that's undeserving, especially with, it always came down to how things, you know, ended as well with my work too, that I'm not deserving of this compassion. So noticing that fear, noticing that resistance, and working with that was really helpful, because that was certainly the more powerful one that was getting in the way for me really allowing that compassion in. That was, you know, certainly around. I just, like pushing it back.
I mean, it sounds like you really, you know, kind of went to first principles, you know, rest, exercise, you know, support and connection with others, you know, those sort of really key aspects, which had kind of, I guess, been lost, or you know, there wasn't enough time, or, you know, you were sort of hiding a little bit from it.
Yeah, definitely lost. Particularly the other thing I came to realize, and I realized this before February 21, which was my connections were really suffering, and not only were they suffering, I hadn't really established a really good community around me, like just how I was doing relationships, particularly friendships. And so a lot of that year was also around doing an overhaul of how I do relationships, particularly friendships. And so worked a lot in that area, because my other compassionate other, in his own beautiful way, is my husband, Ryan. He was certainly, and still is, you know, there for me, and, you know, that many countless hours of me sobbing and things like that, and his presence, you know, that was, like, really, he was the rock during that time. But that it was more these other, my other relationships, that I was the person who was the compassionate. I was the one giving out, and it was no one's fault but my own. That's how I did relationships. That is how I did friendships. And I was wondering why I was always resentful and annoyed. Well, so there's a lot of work in that area as well, connection, because that was suffering. And like you said, that's a primary well-being thing, is having, you know, connections and solid relationships around you. And I didn't have that in my friendship group. I feel like I've got that now. It's growing. It's still. So that was a big one.
Well, so tell us a bit about your work now, because one of the other things that I feel I've noticed for you is that this has now also become a part of the meaningful work that you're doing, that you are helping yourself and others, and sort of, you know, trying to keep balance in all of that and so on. But what tell us about your work now.
Well, one of the things that kind of just have to rewind a little bit, like when I left, I just didn't know if clinical psychology or psychology was the area that I was meant to be in, or felt I needed to be in, or whatever it was. I was just really confused. That question was really bouncing around prior to that, when everything you know, came to a head, but even afterwards. And I benched that question for a very long time, because I just needed to focus on healing. And you know, one of the things I learned through psychology is don't make any big decisions while you're not okay, so if possible. So I left that one, but started to revisit it in I went back to work. I actually started working in July 21, but that was as a lecturer, teaching counsellors in bachelor and masters of counselling, and that was interesting work. And So I was dabbling back into the work, but just not the one-on-one therapy. And it was, I think it was until like October 22, no, actually July 22, that I really started entertaining that question again. Do I want to actually go back to psychology work? And what I actually realized through some work around, well, obviously being a lot more compassionate towards myself and listening and hearing, and really believing that I deserve a life that is, thriving, and I just, what do I want in my work life? And I actually drew it back and just said work life, and 4 values slowly started to appear. And being acceptance, commitment, therapy therapist, I drew on values, and they're actually on my board behind me. But one of them was community, and compassion is another, wisdom and authenticity. And I don't know what else came up, but I actually knew that, okay, no, I do want to work in the mental health field, because there is a lot of knowledge and skills and experience that I've gained that I'd like to share and still learn and develop and grow. So I was like, okay, I can still, wisdom will certainly be part of that journey back into mental health industry, but also community, building connections, like I realized through my own experience now, but also in my practice as a psychologist all throughout, how important community is and connection, that I see those who really thrive and get through are people who do have strong connections. So community is a big one for me. And I feel in the mental health industry, there's room for that. And that's why I do group work and trying to get out there in the community and doing work there. And authenticity, that's why I share my story. And learning that it's okay to be me, whatever psychologist Shannon is, she's a human, and being authentic and hopefully empowering others to do the same, just through my own authenticity. And what was the other? And compassion, of course. And so I just felt like
across the three flows.
And that too, because I knew my flows were totally out, like through your book and Paul Gilbert's work, and certainly, and Haley, certainly realizing my flows were, particularly when I realized the compassion towards myself, from others towards me. And I was like, whoa, I just didn't realize I knew about compassion and working in it. I'm like, oh, I'm totally out. But the 3 flows, definitely. So I just realized that, and just knowing, I think one of the things I didn't realize as a trainee psychologist is that there's so much opportunity that, the mental health industry is quite wide and varied, and there's so many avenues you can go in, and teaching for a while really allowed that too, because I met so many people that came from all walks of, like some clinical psych herself who came into teaching to get a bit of a break from it, but a break from working in the one-on-one, but also to diversify and explore different avenues. And I think that, because I used to have a very narrow view of because of that ideal self, or the, clinician, that I didn't, I can build a work life. I can build a life within the mental health field that is aligned with those values. And so that's and I'm just, at the moment, I'm not sure if it will be the area that I stay in, but burnout is an area of interest and exploration. So I'm staying there, but it may move and vary, and I'm just keeping a very open view, and just leading with, I suppose, whatever I feel of interest or passionate towards, and that I can give back in as well, that I can give in.
There's a lot of thought and consideration, and there's sort of, things change, and those, you've sort of embraced all of that. I just to you didn't actually mention that during your first year of recovery, you did a lot of creative stuff as well. You wrote your blog, which the gap year, and beautifully written, and kind of sort of expressing some of the vulnerability, but also kind of, you sort of were able to share these little aspects, or big aspects, of the journey and insights and so on along the way. And so that was an important part.
That was a huge part. That's a huge part of learning, because I actually made the choice pretty soon after burning out there in Feb that I was going to keep a journal. And because I felt like I was so out of touch with myself, because how in touch can you be when you're so busy and you're so caught up in that threat mode and drive mode, which I was certainly in those cycles, and very little tapping into the soothing mode. So the journal was a way to really observe myself. And the burnout literature, interesting enough, says, self-observation is certainly part of the picture in terms of recovery. And I think that goes to say in anything really. But so I journaled, and then I decided at some point that I wanted to share that. And so I developed a website and put my journal up there as a blog, and for anyone to, and it felt like a way I can help people without being one-on-one, and I can give back in that way. And I now know too, that was me trying to connect, and because it's nice to get compassion, of course, from other people, but other people who are going through it and living it and understand it to that real depth, because they're walking in those shoes. It's like, I feel that kind of support is so important. And so, so I put that out there, and then I think it was July 21. No, I know it was July 21. I put the first episode out of my podcast, which was called something different back then, but it's called When Burnout Becomes Reality, which I think is quite a good title there for my experience. And they're all about expression and sharing my story, but also the podcast was about others then expressing and sharing their stories and learning and connecting through each other's stories, which I really love. And so that was, and I love being creative. That should be actually one of my values, because creativity is a huge part of me, and that was certainly squished and squashed or whatever prior to burning out. I never, it got tapped into here and there with creating group programs in various or the last practice that I worked at. I got to develop actually a self-compassionate program that we rolled out once, but then COVID hit. COVID. So that got squashed, but that was an outlet of because I got to be involved in creating that and developing the mindfulness program that we had out there as well, and I loved that. And group was that connection, community, and authenticity, because you got people sharing their stories, and anyway, so I got to do that through my journal, my blog, and the podcast, and I still get to do that because now the journal is a book. Well, it's not published yet, but I've turned it into a book. So hopefully it'll be out in the end of the year. Yeah.
Wow. Congratulations. Now, I remember following along that. Oh, am I allowed to reminisce the original name, or is that not?
Yeah, you can. Yeah. I love the original name. That took a lot to let go of. I'm like,
especially for the blog, or the journal. Burnout, a different kind of gap year was what you called it, and I mean, that's it. That title itself is just very moving, and so that was really precious, and I that's great to hear that it's coming together into a book. And then the podcast as well. I mean, you've interviewed really people from lots of walks of life too. I think it's not just even I don't think you're only interviewing mental health related people, but people in for example, like you said early on, mothers who kind of have experienced sort of the burnout related there and that sort of thing. So you are sort of remaining prolific, but certainly with one eye on the self by the sounds of it. Well, actually, one question I was going to ask you out of that, I mean, what do you believe really maybe needs to change in the world of psychotherapy or the world of clinical psychology, and maybe like how it's done or something? I mean, if you were to sort of think big like that, I mean, do you have any thoughts there?
I've had discussions with a couple of people, so a couple of ideas and bouncing off theirs as well. Like one of the things I think in the clinical psychology, that having conversations around the different avenues, like how work could look like as a clinical psych, because it sounds like, just in the conversations I'm having, is that there's quite a narrow, okay, you go into private practice and you're working one-on-one, but that maybe, I suppose, career, I don't know, conversations around what your career may look like. But what your career may look like that's actually conducive to your well-being. Because 6 clients a day, 4 days a week for me, and sometimes you've got to live it till you actually know as well. Like I realize there's a bit of trial and error, hit and miss, you know, but I don't know, like, and I don't know if this is something that needs to happen in undergrad or needs to happen in the postgrad, but conversations around well-being and career, like, and not just conversations, but even maybe programs that outside of supervision, outside of university, that are focused on on that well-being, and I don't have all the answers, but I think some sort of focus somewhere, because it wasn't till really with Dr. Hayley D. Quinn that was the way in which she works, you know, that the focus was on my well-being and how that, so, you know, that compassion focused therapy from the inside out kind of thing, you know, so in order to learn and apply it, she was applying it to me, and it was through that I got to really understanding how the work was affecting me and why it was affecting me too. Like there was things I didn't understand about myself, about my personality, about how I thrive. And so I just feel like that really needs to come, as a preventative measure sometime in, you know, post-grad or to, you know, capture those who go on in those other avenues as well, into psychology, you know, some sort of wellbeing program. But I don't have all those answers yet.
I think that's a good way to think about it. It just needs to be an earlier part of the conversation. Really, it's very difficult. It's really difficult to. I do feel like there's a lot in what you said too about, you know, it's difficult to really get it till you live it type thing as well. It's sort of hard for people who are just, you know, conceptualizing this idea of a career as a therapist, but nevertheless it should perhaps be in the conversation.
And actually, because I was working when I was working as a lecturer, I was part of a peer supervision group of a couple of lecturers at a university, and who teach in the postgrad, and they said certainly they're doing a lot more work in those initial phases of the postgraduate program around the importance of well-being, around self-care, much more than when I went through. So there's improvement happening, and an awareness that this needs to happen. But and they also recognize that more is needed, and that being part of the conversation, I think, just part of the conversation as well. And I don't want to lug another, I'm aware that I'm not a trained supervisor, but I'd imagine there's so much that you have to focus on that I don't want to lug that as another thing on that relationship. And I know in my training, I was recommended to go, you know, seek therapy, you know, in that avenue, which was great advice. And I certainly did that. But I almost feel like there's just something else. I don't know. And it's something that I'm thinking about too, because I love doing groups, and I love working with, and I want to do something in that student space, you know, in that trainee space, in the provisional psych space, to help support that. I just haven't come up with that yet.
Something for in and around the training and supervision, the early career psychs, and then gradually, you know, sort of across one's career, I suppose. It sort of, it's part of the conversation early, but then stays on the agenda throughout, I suppose. It really needs to be one of the pillars, I suppose. It needs to be of what it is to be a therapist, is
definitely
self-care.
Oh, definitely. And definitely. So I like that, one of the pillars, and not just at that early career we want to, but an agenda item that is continual, because it's going to be continual for me. Like I lose sight of it. Certainly. Go back there.
So, well, thinking of maybe early career people, I suppose, was the group that I had in mind for this question, and not wanting to put you on the spot, but what might be the top 3 tips, really, then, would you say? Like, one of the things that I've noticed in when I send you an email, I get a little email back that says, I I go and look at my emails between these out, like
Oh,
you give direct feedback to the
Mm.
person, which
Mm.
then creates a kind of a nice boundary for you, because you have to kind of, organize yourself around those allotted times. But it's also good for the receiver, because they know that, they might not hear back to you. So I really thought even little things like that. But yeah, so
definitely
three tips.
Yeah, 3 tips. Oh, you are putting me on the spot. But I did think I actually thought about the 2 things that came up for me, and they're more like themes, but like investing in you. I know that sounds it's so wide and varied, and can lead to so many things, but it's that whole mask on you first, because if you don't, you can end up affecting those around you. And we have an ethical but a moral obligation. And I know we don't get into this field without a want and desire to help and support people. So we can't do that without supporting ourselves. So invest in you. And it can be things like the boundary setting, around like the times that you work, and having a clear, start and finish. It can be, when you're answering emails, like I'm working towards, I haven't got this yet, but that I only look at emails at a certain time of day, in the morning and then the afternoon. At the moment, I kind of look at them all throughout the day, which does not work for me emotionally and mentally. I noticed that. So, putting boundaries around those things as well. But I think boundaries happen when you have that overall want and desire to invest in you. And I think I know that's where compassion comes from too, in that work around there, to actually put yourself first or put your needs up there, invest in you, whatever that may look like. But I also, my other tip or my other overall theme is invest in community, like build your community. I didn't invest in that, and that leaves you vulnerable. We can't walk this earth on our own. I despise those messages you see up on the internet, like, can't even think of one now, but they really glorify that, doing it on your own. And I mean, good, like, if sometimes we don't have that choice and we have had to pull ourselves up and do it on our own. And but my wish for those people is that they do find their people, that they find people they can connect with, that truly have their back, including themselves. And they invest in those relationships, they invest in those people who invest in you, and build that community. It may be one person to start with, it may be a cycle, but invest, because that's what really I shudder to think I would have gotten through it, but without Ryan, my partner, like, that was a huge, because that was the only person I really truly let see that what I felt ashamed about, first. And that was a springboard to do that with others, with Haley, with my, director Ilsa, and with the psych eventually, and then with others. So I don't know. So I know they're not really tips, but they're like
investing. That's great. Investing in self and investing in community, and sort of it's all about trying to sort of nurture the resource, isn't it, that is us, in a way. And because if we're able to invest in those things, then we can start investing in others, work and clients and so on.
They're like your pillars to then, when you then that compassion out, that investment you're giving to others, you get that by investing in your community. It that gives you that energy to do that work. And I mean, I hear it so often. There's a lovely psych working with at the moment, and has a beautiful group of other psychs, and I'm like, oh, okay, there's a beautiful protective factor there, that that they have this community that they can fall back on and receive support as they do this work. It just makes sense. It makes sense. And we know connection is very important to well-being. So
All right, Chan, well, thank you very much for coming and talking to me on compassion in a t-shirt. And I suppose one last thing, where can people find you, sort of, I guess, online or elsewhere?
Yeah, well, as you were talking about earlier, I had that title, Burnout, a Different Kind of Gap Year, which changed. There's now,
Yes.
and it changed for the times. As I moved back, into my role as a psychologist, I changed the name to Burnout Psychology Support. So the easiest way to get in touch with me is jump on my website, which is www.burnoutspsychologysupport.com. And I am on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook with the same name, Burnout Psychology Support. And the podcast can be found on my website, but anywhere you listen to your podcasts. And I will just flag the name of the book, which I only just recently settled on.
Please.
It's called Nothing Left to Give, a psychologist's path back from burnout. That's what it's called. Yeah, Nothing Left to Give. No,
Yeah. Very
Nothing
clever.
Left to Give. Yeah. Working on the cover at the moment, or an artist is. So yeah, hoping to have that out in October. And yeah, I hope it's helpful to others to hear my journey.
Wonderful. Well, I'll put some of those links in the notes and so on. But well, thank you, and thank you for all the work you're doing, and for sharing your journey. And probably the big one is just kind of trying to keep raising the awareness for people so that they invest in themselves and their community.
Definitely.
So thank you.
Thank you so much, Stan, for having me on. I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.